What does it mean to share the gospel with your neighbor? What does it mean to believe it and share it? The more that we're sensitive to how much we're aligned with God's story, the more we can listen to someone else, tell their story, tell their perspective, tell their narrative. And we'll begin to see where there's places, opportunities over time where we could say, I believe God would have an invitation for you in this area of your life. But it starts with us. We have to be able to examine ourselves wherever we're at today, believing or not the Christian story. Where are we at? So this story is into 4 parts, and all of my slides are magically managed, so you're really going to have to listen to me. More than normal, I usually might take it out. So there's 4 parts to the story that God paints for us. And the first part is creation. And we were created to be in perfect relationship with God. The second part is the fall, as I described. We decided we didn't need perfect relationship with God. We could be God on our own. We could do this on our own, and that was the fall. And the third part is redemption. That's when Christ comes to restore us to that relationship that He originally intended. But it's still only a partial restoration because, as we're all very well aware, we're still in a broken world. This world is not perfect. Christ came to give us a foretaste of the perfection to come, but we're still in the midst of this, which brings us to the final part of the story, which is restoration. God will bring everything back into a relationship with Himself. God will restore creation completely to what it was meant to be in the future. But that future gives us hope for today, but it also keeps our perspective in line that we're not quite there yet. It's the theologians use the term the already but not yet. Jesus has already come, but He is still coming, and so right now we're in the in-between. So I want to walk through these different parts of the story and see how much do we believe and follow God's story, and how much would He correct our hearts today, and how much would we be able to have that conversation with someone else who is searching. So first of all is creation. And the simple point of creation is that you were all created in God's image, and you were created to have a relationship with God. Those 2 things communicate 4 really important basic things of who we are. Foundationally, it communicates your identity. And through that identity, it communicates a couple things. Number 1, value. You are valued because you're made in the image of God. Every single one of you is a distinct reflection of who God is. Your different backgrounds, your different personalities, your different skills, all the little nuances of what make you you are all a picture of God Himself. God is reflected in you in a different way, and it's an incredible thing to think that we have 6 billion people roughly on this planet. Every single one of them is a small picture of who God is. There's value put on every human individual in the Christian story because you're made in the image of the Creator of the universe. You reflect God Himself. And secondly, there is purpose, because that purpose is to have relationship with God, is to be connected with God in relationship. And that purpose, that value and that purpose and identity ultimately bring fulfillment. The Christian story says you have value. Every person wants value. Every person wants to be loved. Every person wants to know they're worth something. Every person wants purpose. They want to have meaning to their lives. And Christianity says that is available to you. Doesn't like the sermon. Every person has purpose, and everybody wants fulfillment. We want to know why we're here. We want to know our value and our purpose. The Christian story is here to tell you. All of that is found in the creation. God created you with this desire for Him, and in Him I will contend with you that desire for value and purpose is met. As I tried to think of how to illustrate this, I know I gave an illustration several weeks ago, and I'll use a different one so I don't bore you. The first one, briefly, I'll say there was this commercial of an old man using an iPad that was given to him by his daughter. And she asked him how his iPad was doing, and then you see him, oh, it's great. He's chopping carrots on his iPad and shuffling the carrots into the trash can. And we were shocked at that commercial because we can't believe that you would misunderstand the value and misunderstand the purpose of that iPad so much. But I said if we spent centuries removed from iPads, somebody came back one day and saw an iPad, they would say, no, it's a cutting board. And it would take someone who actually knew why it was created and actually knew the purpose of it and wasn't stuck in all the misunderstanding to re-explain what it was there for. I would say to you, that's the fallen world. You were made for relationship with God. You were made for purpose with God. But we can get so mired into this world that we can completely forget that. And the world and its narratives can convince you that that's not the case anymore. But another picture that I thought of, I didn't think of this picture. The idea popped in my head and I Googled it, and sure enough, but it's a picture of a roll of toilet paper made of $100 bills. And this is actually a picture that a basketball player took, basically to demonstrate his extreme wealth, and said something like, I wipe my butt with $100 bills, that's how wealthy I am. And you see that picture, and that's not the true value of those $100 bills. I'm looking at that picture and I'm thinking it's probably a few $1,000s, and the value of it being used for something we don't need to talk about in detail. And the purpose of that money being used for something it was not meant to be used for. And it's appalling, especially in impoverished countries. That picture's very offensive. But it's appalling, it's disturbing, it's odd that someone would abuse something so wrongly for what it wasn't made for. But especially somewhat the gross imagery of that picture, I thought might even be one of the better illustrations of when people are completely lost in sin and some of the egregious things that go on in our world. I think of that as an illustration, certainly of something like sex trafficking or slavery, where people who are all reflections of the image of God are literally used like trash, are used like stuff to be thrown away. And that's what the fall brings. That's what, when we want to live independently of God, brings. We begin to objectify people. And we may not see ourselves in the light of something horrible like that as sex trafficking or slavery or the dark net, any of those kind of different things. But in some way, the more that we worship something that's not God as God, we talked about this some last week, the more we idolize the wrong thing, the more that thing becomes a God to us, whether it's our job, even our family, or our achievements, or our money. The more we distance ourselves from people, and the more we treat people like objects for scaling the corporate ladder, for gaining more money, for making me feel better about myself, and we don't value them simply for the human being and image of God that they are. And that's what sin does. It not only separates us from God, but it begins to separate us from people. When we worship the wrong things, people become something to puff me up rather than to be worshipped for who they are in God's eyes. So I wanted to take a moment to really understand the creation portion of this story, meaning to understand ourselves. How much do I really find my value and my purpose in Christ and God? Or is there something else? If I think, and as I ask you this question, I kind of want to dial it back. I know I kind of painted a dark picture of finding your value and purpose in the wrong place. But not to feel bad about it, but it's okay to just genuinely think, if someone asks you, where do you find your value? What are some of the things that pop in your head? And those things don't have to be inherently bad. The thing about sin is we take something that can be good and we make it worse. It's not bad to find approval in your parents. It's not bad to find approval in meaning your job. But when that thing becomes your God, then it gets out of whack. But I want you to think about that for a second, because if anything, it's something to be mindful of. If you think to yourself, where do I find my value? And you list, you might say your job, you might say my children, you might say my savings or my retirement, or you might say helping other people. It can be all kinds of different things. And all those things can be good, they can be bad, they can be... But as we're mindful of that, it's something to think, could that thing get out of hand? Could I find too much of my value in that? Is Christ at the top of where I find my value? If you only find your value in your job, if you only find your value in the things that you do and in helping other people, that will eventually wear you out, because you're ultimately meant to find your value in Christ. Same thing with your purpose. You find your meaning in whatever it is that you do, and think about that question honestly, and not to be condemning, but it's okay to reflect on that. When I think, where do I find my purpose? What pops in your head? And those things can be good, they can be bad, they can be neutral. But as you're mindful of that, you can be mindful of, maybe this is an area that I need to be careful of how much purpose I find there. Or is that purpose really secondary to my purpose that God has for me? This is a big question when we're making big life decisions. There can be decisions that neither one of them are necessarily good or bad, where I move, what job I take, start a family, or adopt a child, all kinds of different big life decisions. And there's not necessarily a good or a bad answer, but the main answer is, am I primarily concerned with what God may be asking me to do? Am I going through a spiritual discernment process, or am I just, what do I want instead? And that would be a place where maybe that thing's a little too primary, not secondary. So it's important, if we're really living God's story, we think about, where do I find my value? Where do I find my purpose? And are there places where I need to push that a little bit more back toward Christ? And so the more that we do that, the more as you listen to other people's stories, you'll hear where they find their value and their purpose. It just comes out. When you have a conversation, you get to know someone well enough. If they really love their job, or they love their family, or they love certain things, the way they spend their time, you'll get a picture of where they find affirmation, where they find value, where they find purpose. And if you get more and more of a picture, especially if they simply say, I don't believe, or whatever, you'll get more and more of a picture of if that thing is their source of value and purpose. And at some point, all temporary sources of value and purpose will not completely fulfill us. You might lose your job. You might lose that family member. You might have whatever it is that you prioritize come out of your hands. And that might be an opportunity where the gospel is there to be shared to say, well, your real value and purpose was always greater than that. This is thinking in terms of the creation narrative, why we're made, how we find fulfillment, and listening to other people, and figuring out where they find the value and purpose. So secondly, the second part of the story is the fall. And as I said, basically the fall was that we decided to cut ourselves off from God. And in Genesis 1:27, it says that, Genesis 3:23, it says that Adam and Eve ate of the fruit, and then God kicked them out of the garden because they couldn't live forever be with God anymore. Some people read that story and they think, well, that was so unfair, why did God do that? We chose to leave, and literally that was sin, because sin just defined simply as living independently of God. You decide to live independently of God, that's sin. So it's a contradiction in terms to say, we don't want to be with God anymore, we want to do this on our own, but we want to live with God forever. God simply could not coincide with that. You want to do your own thing, so we can't live in this eternal relationship as it was anymore. And that, as I said, that narrative carries over today. But this is the big thing about the Christian story. This might be one of the most practical things that you'll see in your day-to-day life, is that in the Christian story, sin is the problem. The problem with the world is sin. The thing that we see in the world, on the news, and in every different form of media is that sin is not the problem. Education is the problem. Government is the problem. People and man-made systems are the problem. And if we could just feed people the right way, if we could help people the right way, if we could do a series of different things, that would fix the problem. And the Christian story says those things are all maybe a part of the problem, but the real problem is sin. The real problem is our decision to live independently of God. And on the flip side, we find our identity, our value, our purpose, and our fulfillment in knowing who we were created to be. Sin causes us to have a sense of loss of value. We lose our purpose, we lose our identity, we find it in other places, and we lose our fulfillment. Because when you're trying to find your value and your purpose in things that are not God, you were meant to find your value and purpose in God, and it will ultimately be unfulfilling. I also touched on that some last week. But this is important for us to think about. We talked about suffering several weeks ago, and the suffering and the problems in the world. There's two kinds of suffering that I would suggest to you. Number one is self-imposed suffering. And a harsh reality of a lot of what we go through in our lives is when we worship the wrong thing, we put our value in the wrong thing, and that thing fails us, we suffer. I talked about first world problems when we worship the fact that it's 70 degrees in my house all day long, and then someone sets it to 65, my whole world crumbles. It's far too cold. And we worship this, but more seriously, it could be we worship this God of comfort. And so when something makes us uncomfortable, we become so accustomed to that I suffer because I put my peace in the wrong thing. And then of course there's serious problems. But when we worship other people's praise, when we worship our job, when we worship those things that really get to the core of who we are, and then we lose those things, we do really suffer. But I would suggest to you that if your primary meaning, your primary value and purpose is in Christ, those things come and go, those things fade, but you're ultimately secure. As Paul said, I can go through abundance and lack through Christ who strengthens me. But then I also said that there is suffering that is unavoidable. We are in a broken world. There is suffering that is caused by other people that you cannot control. But I would say all of that is ultimately from sin. It's people living independently of God, causing suffering in the world. But where this is really difficult for us is that we may be really good at pointing out other people's sin, the other problems in the world, but dealing with our own self-imposed suffering is much more difficult. so a big piece of, am I really living the story of God, I think, is how mindful and repentant am I of my own sins and my own issues and my own stuff. Or how quick am I to blame the problems of my life? How quick am I to blame my suffering? How quick am I to blame whatever is wrong in the world externally, rather than take some time to reflect internally? And then sometimes the external is the blame. That's true. But how much are we letting the gospel work its way through us internally? It gets at the core of the gospel when Jesus says, forgive in the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our debts. We need to be forgiven as we forgive our debtors. And he goes as far to say, if you don't forgive others when they sin against you, the Father in heaven will not forgive you. It's one of those really like punch you in the face statements that Jesus makes. But that's at the core of the gospel, is that sin is the problem, and that problem starts with you. And for the solution to work its way through the world, for the story to work its way through the world, it starts with you dealing with whatever he needs to deal with in you unto other people. And I thought of this story. This was told by Pastor Jeff Vanderstelt. He's the pastor of Doxa Church, and he leads this ministry called Soma Community of Churches. He talks about this lady named Nikki that they reached out to for almost 2 years. It was their neighbor, and she was not a very nice woman. She was a hermit, kind of. So she never came out very much. When she did, she was very short, very harsh. She would yell at them for stuff they had in their yards, and all kinds of different things. Very difficult to get along with. But they consistently loved her despite her brokenness. And so one day she came to the front door and she spilled her guts to the wife of all the stuff going on in her life. And then through that, they, in some ways, adopted her as family. And she came to their family gatherings and all these things. And they were loving on her, as I believe the church is called to love people. So that one day she comes to talk to Jeff, and she says, I gave my life to Christ last night, and they asked her to tell the story. And she basically was up all night praying and finally believed this Jesus thing was for real and accepted Christ and asked him first to forgive her for all the things that she had done and the harshness she had had in her heart and all those kind of things. But then without a theology teacher there, without someone walking through the way that the gospel works next to her, she innately, intuitively, I would say, through the Spirit of God leading her, naturally began to pray for and forgive all the people that hurt her in her life. She had been in a few different abusive relationships. And I know our gut reaction to those is that this man or this woman was the perpetrator, and they need to be to blame, and we need to help the victim. And there is some truth to that, but the gospel would say even the perpetrator needs the love and the forgiveness of Christ. Now, Nikki, before she had that encounter with Christ, I know that they mentioned she had talked about those relationships. She was not ready to do that. But as Christ began to work on her heart, she just instinctively felt the Spirit of God leading her to pray for those men who had hurt her. That's what the gospel will do. Cause us to radically love even those who have hurt us. And to see to see past, oh, he's mean because of his parents, or he's mean because he's poor, or he's mean because he has sin in his life, because we're all born into sin, me too. So when we think in our own lives, how much are we willing to look at ourselves before we look at others, is a big picture of how much am I living the Christian story. And the more that we listen to other people, the more we'll get a picture of how much do they want to blame other people, or how much are they willing to look at themselves, and through the Spirit of God we'll have opportunities to say, maybe there's something there for you to look at, rather than at the other person. Thirdly, which I've already got to in different ways in the Christian story, is redemption, and that is that Christ comes to restore that relationship and that brokenness. And this is, we could walk through the Roman road and all that kind of stuff, but Romans 3:23 says that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. To go back to what I said, that's a key thing to always remind ourselves. Do we really believe that? Because when we say someone should have, or they could have, I can't believe they did this, how much do we really believe? Well, because everyone's broken. That's the Christian answer, but we struggle really accepting that. But everyone has sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But all are saved by the grace, the free gift, the grace of Christ. That is the redemption, that's the restoration, that's the intervention of Christ in people's stories. So this one is as simple as people, I've already talked about this, people looking for their value, their purpose, their meaning, their fulfillment in other places aside from Christ. What are the opportunities to point them toward Christ? If they're looking for the love from their parents, God is the perfect Father. If they're looking for wealth, in Christ is abundant riches. There's all kinds of ways that Christ is the answer to the yearning of our hearts. But I know I've already kind of really touched on that, so I won't belabor the point. But I want to give this story. This is a story of an atheist about 8 years ago who said that Africa needs God. And I give this story because in the Christian story, sin is the problem and Christ is the answer. And as I said, through a natural perspective, we think all these other things, education and government and charity and philanthropy, those things are the problem, and if we would just address those things, that would solve the problem. But this is so compelling. There's an atheist 8 years ago who wrote this about the problem in Africa. And he says, now a confirmed atheist, I've become convinced of the enormous contribution Christian evangelism makes in Africa, sharply distinct from the work of secular and non-government organizations, government projects, and international aid efforts. These alone will not do. Education and training will not do. He went on to say, in Africa, Christianity changes people's hearts. I would say everywhere, but he's an atheist, so I give him some credit. It brings a spiritual transformation. The rebirth is real. The change is good. It would suit me to believe that their honesty, their diligence, and optimism in their work were unconnected with personal faith. He admits this. But even though their work may have secular benefits, it was surely affected by what they were, what they identified themselves as. Influenced by a conception of man's place in the universe that Christianity has taught. Influenced by their place in the universe that Christianity has taught. Basically, that they live by the Christian story. That according to Christianity, we have value, we have purpose, and part of that value and purpose is to point others toward Christ where they find that value and that purpose, to deal with the fundamental problem, which is sin, to be redeemed by Christ and transformed, and that redemption will then flow into all other areas of life. Even an atheist is able to identify in a very broken continent how the Christian message is bringing real transformation, far more profound than our secular, worldly, non-spiritual efforts have been able to accomplish. So for us personally, how much do we look to the natural things to fix our problems? And are there any areas where we aren't honestly fully depending on Christ to deal with the discontentment in our heart, to deal with our suffering, to deal with different things in our lives? Christ is ultimately the solution that we're going to pour into all those other areas. So finally, and this already kind of bled into this, but as Christ transforms, He restores and He pours out into all the people and all the things around us. And that's the final portion of the story, which is restoration. That Christ will ultimately restore everything, and He's currently restoring it through us unto that everything. And that was the quote that we read at the beginning. I'm going to come back to as we conclude. But what I wanted to do for this was I'm going to read the passage from Revelation 21. And I know that with Revelation, and any biblical scholars around here, we understand there's a lot of imagery, it's very dramatic language, but what I don't want to do, a lot of times what we do, especially in our kind of Western pragmatic mindset, is we say, oh, there's all this imagery, so I need to cut that out, and I need to get to just the black and white, give me the facts. That's not how poetry works. That's not how literature works. Part of the message is the imagery. Part of what is compelling about what the Apostle John is saying here is that he had a vision that was beyond what he could really explain to try to communicate in dramatic language just how powerful and captivating and transformative this message really is. So what I actually would like you to do is close your eyes, because I want to read this, and I want you to really allow this imagery to be real to you. Because what John is trying to do is paint an image that really does pull at your heart and speak something transformative and real to you about what the Christian story is ultimately moving toward and is prayerfully moving toward through you today. So Revelation 21, verse 1 through 4. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away." This is the hope of the Christian story, of where we're going, but also that we gain foretastes of that now. There are pictures we get when the mourning is addressed by the comfort of Christ. There's pictures we get where the tears are wiped away by the comfort of Christ. There's pictures we get of God's kingdom here and now. Jesus said, when he read from Luke 4, "I am here to fulfill the prophecy, the kingdom of heaven is here. To set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach liberty to the captives." That is a picture for the future, but it's a picture of what God is doing through us and prayerfully through us today. And that our identity and our value and our purpose and our fulfillment is found in the God who created us, flows through us, and we're able to invite others into that identity, that value, that purpose, and fulfillment as well. And the more we do that, the more we give a picture, a foretaste, a snapshot of this ultimate restoration that God is moving towards. And that's what the church is supposed to be, and that's prayerfully as we are loving our neighbors, as we're listening to their stories, as we're listening to opportunities to talk to them about who God is, that more and more the church is a reflection of this picture that John gives of the conclusion. Of mourning that's wiped away, of tears that are wiped away, of God dwelling with man, of God being amongst us. That's what the church is meant to be. So for us today, ultimately, it's a question of how much will we surrender to his story in our lives? How much will we worship him primarily for our value, purpose, and identity? And then what are the things we may need to set aside, things he's working on us for, to set aside, or finding too much value, purpose, and identity? The more we do that, the more he's real in us, the more he's real to others. So what I want to do to conclude, and the band will come up and sing the song "I Surrender," is invite us to continue to surrender ourselves to God's story. And I pray that we're also thinking about the stories of our neighbors, we're thinking about the stories of our friends, and where are there opportunities to invite them into the story of God. But I want to read what we read earlier about being the church that's living into God's future today. To conclude my talk with you this morning and take with you throughout the rest of this week. We are the church that lives into God's future today. A church united across space and time. A church of many races, languages, and ethnicities. A church that lives by the work of God in Christ. That was, is now, and is still to come. The one who is seated on the throne says to us, "See, I am making all things new. A new heaven and a new earth, where the home of God is among God's people." God's future is epic, and it is good news. Remember God's future, for this is our story.